She was 29 years old when she stood at the end of her father-in-law's lane with a single carpet bag and $4 knotted into a handkerchief, cast out by Holman Tate, who declared that a widow with no sons was no daughter of his family any longer and owed nothing further from his table. She had buried her husband, Wesley, the previous spring after a fever took him in 3 days, and when the year of mourning ended, so had her welcome. She left the Tate farm outside Concordia, Kansas, in the gray hour before sunrise in the autumn of 1888, with nothing to her name but that handkerchief of coins and a wedding ring she would not sell. She walked the 11 miles into the town of Birch Hollow, where she had heard from a drover passing through that the old livery stable on the South Road stood empty and condemned, its roof half collapsed, its stalls gone to rot, and that the town would let it go for almost nothing, just to be rid of the liability. She paid her $4 to the town clerk that same afternoon, and the men in the mercantile laughed behind their hands at the sight of a woman in a black mourning dress, signing for a ruin no sensible man would touch. But what waited beneath the rotted hayloft of that stable, sealed away and forgotten for nearly 20 years, would not only deliver her from poverty, but uncover a debt the town of Birch Hollow owed and had long since chosen to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Iris Calloway. If you have ever been cast aside by people who were supposed to stand by you and found your own way forward anyhow, tell us about it in the comments. This video is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents depicted are either the product of imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Iris had not always been a Tate by marriage and a stranger by exile. She was raised the daughter of a harness maker in Salina, a careful and patient man who taught her to work leather and rope and to read the conformation of a horse the way other girls were taught embroidery. And from her mother, who kept the family accounts with a precision that left no figure unaccounted for, she learned that a ledger was a kind of honesty made visible, that numbers did not lie, even when people did. She married Wesley Tate at 22 for the plain and uncomplicated reason that he was kind to her in a world that mostly was not. And she came to his father's farm prepared to work, which she did, without complaint, for 7 years. Wesley's death left her with grief and very little else, since the farm and its modest holdings passed by custom and by law to Holman Tate, who had never approved of his son's choice of wife, and saw her continued presence as an obligation he was glad to discharge. She left the only home she had known in this new life with the same steadiness her mother had shown over a ledger book, recording the injustice plainly in her own mind, without bitterness, and turning her attention instead to what could still be done. The livery stable, when she first stepped inside it, smelled of old straw and standing rain, and the particular mustiness of wood that has not felt sun in years. Half the roof had fallen through above the rear stalls, but the front of the building and the loft above the tack room had somehow held, dry and intact, beneath a stretch of roof that had simply been forgotten by whoever stripped the place for salvage years before. Iris spent her first days clearing debris with her bare hands, sleeping on a cot she built from scrap lumber, eating little, saying less. It was on the 4th day, while clearing the hayloft of decades of molded straw, that her foot struck something solid beneath the rot, a section of plank flooring that did not match the rest, fitted too neatly, with a small iron ring sunk flush into the wood. She pried it open with a horseshoe nail, and found beneath the false floor of the loft a strong box wrapped in oiled canvas, and beside it a leather satchel containing a stable ledger bound in calfskin, its pages dated from 1869 through 1871. The ledger told a story Iris had to read 3 times before she trusted her own understanding of it. The stable had once belonged to a freedman named Solomon Pierce, who had built it himself in the years just after the war, and run it as the only livery in Birch Hollow, willing to board the horses of black settlers and native traders passing through the territory, at a time when the other stables in town turned them away. Pierce's ledger recorded years of honest business, careful bookkeeping, and a thriving trade, until an entry in the spring of 1871 noted a fire of suspicious origin in the rear stalls, after which the entry simply stopped. The strongbox held the rest of the answer: deeds and receipts, proving that Pierce had purchased the land outright, paid in full, 3 years before the fire that the town had always called an accident, and a final unsent letter addressed to the county recorder in Pierce's own hand, naming the men he believed responsible and asking for the law's protection, a letter he had apparently never had the chance to send. Word moved through Birch Hollow quickly once Iris began quietly asking after the Pierce family, and it was old Augustus Renner, whose family had run the rival Livery for 3 generations and now sat on the town council, who came to warn her plainly that digging up matters long settled would not be welcomed, and that a woman alone, new to town and dependent on its goodwill, would do well to remember her position. Iris listened to him without flinching, the same steadiness in her that had carried her down the Tate Lane at dawn, and told him only that she intended to find out whether any Pierce descendants remained, because a debt recorded in ink did not expire simply because it grew inconvenient. She wrote to the county recorder's office in Topeka and learned that Solomon Pierce's granddaughter, Effie Pierce Marsh, was living in Lawrence, working as a seamstress, entirely unaware that her grandfather had ever owned land at all. What followed was not a courtroom spectacle, but a quiet, deliberate unwinding. The original deed, properly filed and witnessed, made the Tate-era town records look exactly like what they were: a parcel improperly reassigned after a fire that the new evidence suggested had not been accidental at all. Effie Marsh arrived in Birch Hollow with the documents Iris had gathered, and a lawyer from Lawrence, and the council, faced with a paper trail it could not argue against, restored the Pierce family's claim to the land and paid a settlement drawn from the very stable fees the town had collected across 2 decades of disputed ownership. Augustus Renner's family, whose stable had absorbed Pierce's old customers in the years following the fire, quietly stepped down from the council rather than face further questions about what his grandfather had known. Iris, who held no legal claim to the land herself beyond her $4 purchase, was given first right to lease the rebuilt stable from Effie Marsh, who insisted the 2 women run it together, a livery once again open to anyone whose horse needed shelter and whose coin was honest, exactly as Solomon Pierce had built it to be. We began this story with a widow cast out at dawn with $4 and no family left to claim her, standing before a ruin everyone else in Birch Hollow had laughed at. We told you that what lay beneath that hayloft would stun the entire town, and now you have seen why. Not treasure for its own sake, but a buried truth that gave a forgotten man's name back to his own family. Iris Calloway never set out to uncover anyone's secret. She only refused to look away from what her own 2 hands found, the same patient honesty her mother had taught her over a ledger book years before. Thank you for spending this evening with us and with Iris Calloway. If her story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that what looks like ruin sometimes only needs an honest hand to uncover what was always there. And we will leave you with this: what is a debt, large or small, that you believe still deserves to be paid? Tell us in the comments. Until next time, stay close.